Conference.
Sorry, I'm recording now. Just wanted to make sure we capture that.
Oh, good. That's very good. Thank you for telling us at this point. So again, this is recorded for everyone, including we intend to record questions as well. But I'm just going to go over the background of this and then sort of set the process that we're going to be using for this meeting. But as I indicated, that obviously the reactions to that special general conference vote covered the full spectrum of opinion, some embracing the traditional plan, some folks fully rejecting it, and many with less intense reactions to it. But nevertheless, this was a dominant topic for the rest of 2019, and that was in anticipation of another general conference to be held in 2020. At Faith, at least, there were sermons on the topic in mid 2019. And then we actually held for our congregation 3 listening sessions where we invited laity to come and ask questions and offer opinions on the topic. And then the pandemic happened. And like so many other things, this topic got superseded by the critical topic of the pandemic. So General Conference was postponed in 2020 and then was postponed again in 2021. The topic, however, did not really go away. As you know, ours is a laity-driven denomination, and we are each called to seek always to love one another and fulfill our mission of using our prayers, our presence, our gifts, and our talents to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And to do that, we need to share and to listen to one another on important issues. And this certainly qualifies as that. So our church council felt that it was appropriate to refamiliarize our laity and the laity in the whole area here with how this issue is and will be addressed within the United Methodist Church. So today is the first of 3 sessions. This will be presented by Reverend Caitlyn Nesbit, who's online here with us, who was recently appointed as the pastor of both the Palos and Evergreen United Methodist Churches. And she will again be dealing with, as I said, the topic being the decision-making process within the UMC and our structure. In July, on July 17th, we'll have a second session, on August, I apologize, this is July 17th. On August 28th, we'll have a discussion on the history of homosexuality conflict within the United Methodist denomination that Reverend Caleb Hogg will present. And then on September 25th, the third and final of those 3 sessions will be entitled The Current Position of the Northern Illinois Conference and How We Got There. And this will be presented by District Superintendent Jock Conway. So what we're going to do today is I've asked Josh Bailey Green, who's with us, to mute everyone but Caitlyn as she makes her presentation. I believe she's also going to have some slides that she'll be putting up as we go along. And what I would urge people to do is if you have questions that come up in your minds as we go along, or even at the onset, use the chat feature and go ahead and type that question. And at the end, we'll get the questions asked in the sequence that they're received. So I think that will be it. As Josh had indicated early on, we are going to tape it. This gives people who weren't able to dial in today an opportunity to hear this later if they so choose, or give us a chance and the other churches a chance to synthesize this and perhaps put the information in their bulletins or other communications to their membership. So without further ado, I turn this over to Caitlyn, and thank you for doing this for us.
Of course. Thank you, Dave. All right. So to get started, I'm talking about both the decision-making process as well as polities to structure, but I think it's helpful to start with the structure of the church and then go from there. So I'll begin by sharing a little bit about the United Methodist structure. I'm not going to go super in depth, so if you do have questions or you want more information, I'm happy to provide it, but it can become really overwhelming. So I'm just going to kind of hit the outlines of things. I can also recommend a book if you want to deep dive into those, but for now, we'll just kind of cover the basics. So there are a lot of ways to imagine the United Methodist Church structure. With confirmation classes, we've done all sorts of different things, but I think what helps me understand it the best and what helps when I'm sharing it with others is to picture it almost like a bullseye. And so starting with the bullseye for the structure of the church, we have the local church. So for my churches, that would be Palos United Methodist Church would be one of those yellow squares or circles. Another circle would be Evergreen Park United Methodist Church would be like a separate one of these, or Faith United Methodist or Mokina, whichever your local church is. It starts with this sort of yellow circle. And at the local church, we have the lay members of the church as well as the clergy member that is appointed there. So that's whoever the pastor or pastors of the church are. From the local church, we go out one more to the district. So we actually just restructured all of our districts starting July 1st. I think all of us are in the Lake South district. I'm pretty sure that all of us are still in Lake South or are now in Lake South district, where we are overseen by our district superintendent, Reverend Jacques Conway. And he's actually going to present the third of these presentations. If you would like to meet or hear from Reverend Conway, you can there. But he is our district superintendent. So inside of this blue circle, there are a lot of other yellow circles that make up the district. So a lot of local churches were structured into a district based on our geography, really. One step out, we have 5 districts within our annual conference. We are part of the Northern Illinois Annual Conference. So we've got lots of the yellow circles that are inside the blue circles. And then we have 5 of those blue circles inside of the red one. That is our annual conference. Annual conference is another geographical area in which we are grouped together, where we have a bishop that presides over us. Our current bishop is an interim bishop, Reverend John, I almost said Jacques Conway again, Reverend John Hopkins, or Bishop John Hopkins, who is our bishop for our annual conference. Our annual conference runs from near the I-80 Illinois River area up north and then east and west. And so that geographical area. And these are all important because depending on your local church or your annual conference, and as we go out, there's sort of different decision-making processes and different things that each of these structures hold. But they are based primarily off of our geographical areas. So we have a bunch of different annual conferences, and then we meet together as annual conferences into a jurisdictional conference. So we are part of the North Central Jurisdictional Conference. We meet with the other annual conferences like Iowa, Illinois Great Rivers, which is Central and South Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, all a part of this North Central jurisdiction, another way that we geographically are put together. So jurisdictional conferences are a thing in the United States. If you are outside of the United States, you have a similar structure, but you are a part of a central conference. And central conferences function a lot like jurisdictional conferences, not completely, but a lot like them. And so you kind of have an idea through this map. If you look at the United States, those are our jurisdictional conferences, but if you look at the rest of the globe, there are 7 central conferences as well. And you get an idea of where those central conferences are. And they become important because that representation is, we have a global representation. And so I just threw that map out there because sometimes it's cool to look and see where those are. Then all of the jurisdictional and central conferences fall under the large umbrella of general conference. And so that is what we were anticipating in 2020, now what we're anticipating for 2022. And general conference meets together every 4 years. Jurisdictional conference meets together every 4 years. And it's a big gathering in which they come together to do the work. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what work they do. But this is sort of the structure. I do have a picture. General conference is this huge event. Like there are so many people. This is from 2019, which was a special general conference. So it's not even like the full-blown general conference, but it just gives you an idea of how many people there are. These huge areas are set up with all of these tables, and I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of Methodists that gather together to do the work of the church. It's pretty cool. Okay, so this is kind of the breakdown. We have our local church, which is a part of a district. Our districts are part of an annual conference. Our annual conferences are a part of a jurisdictional conference. And the jurisdictional conferences, along with the central conferences, make up the general conference. They all are interconnected. I think that's what's helpful about this, is because the local church is still connected to the general conference and the general conference to the local church. They're all pretty well interconnected. So At the local church level, what makes decisions is the charge conference, which happens once every year. Usually in fall, winter time, you'll have a charge conference, church gathers together, they vote on matters of the church. Always a big one to get the budget done in time for the charge conference. And then throughout the rest of the year, we have the charge conference. We also have the pastor that has been appointed there that helps assist and lead in those sort of matters. From the local church, districts don't meet on any sort of annual basis or anything like that. They're usually more resource-based. So they try to connect churches, as we are part of a connectional church, share in resources, things like that. But from the local church, we send delegates to the annual conference. At the local church member, the charge conference, everyone who can vote there is a member of the church. So I always tell my confirmation kids, it's super cool because as soon as you're confirmed, you get to vote on matters of the church. Like your vote it matters. It's a huge thing. So anyone who is a member of the local church has a vote at the charge conference. From the charge conference are approved delegates to the annual conference. Depending on what church you're a part of, there's an algorithm that decides how many representatives you have from the local church to annual conference each year. It's a balance between clergy who are a part of the annual conference and then lay members who are part of the local church and representing that at the annual conference. So we have that balance between clergy and lay at all levels proceeding onward. So from the annual conference, we elect representatives to go to the jurisdictional conference, which meets every 4 years. The annual conference will decide things that are our annual, I have another thing later, but it decides things for our own annual conference, our own clergy, those sort of matters. The jurisdictional conference is about bishops mainly, not totally, but mainly. So that's where we elect bishops. That's where bishops are decided where they are going to preside over. That's sort of the matters within the jurisdiction as well. So for the annual conference, we send delegates, we elect them during annual conference, which we actually just had yesterday and today, finished up today for Northern Illinois Conference. But then we send those delegates to the jurisdictional conference. And I believe that we have 3 lay representatives and 3 clergy representatives this year, or when we elected them, going to the upcoming conference. At annual conference, we also send delegates to general conference. And I believe it's 3 lay and 3 clergy again that we elected. And so there are members of every annual conference that are elected as delegates that go to general conference. And general conference is the place where we are able to change the Constitution or our book of discipline. Those are the more concrete policy or belief changes. That's what we make at general conference. And so more of the structure of the church. So those are the different conferences. This is a little blurry, but if you think that this sounds a little bit like our government, that makes sense. The United Methodist Church was being created the same time as the United States was being created. So there is a little bit of overlap between the two, and they do kind of function in similar ways, not totally, but similar. So if we look at general conference, the legislative branch is general conference. Executive branch is the Council of Bishops, which is every bishop in the world is a part of the Council of Bishops. And the judicial branch is the constitutionality. And so that's where we're talking about, again, what makes up the book of discipline, our discipline as a church, that concrete thing that we follow. The jurisdictional conference or the central conference, we have the College of Bishops. So those are the bishops in that geographical area and handle mainly the rights and responsibilities of bishops. At an annual conference level, you kind of see going through here, executive branch is our resident bishop, and that's the rights and responsibilities of pastors. And there's also certain policies that we decide, like whether we would want our pension to divest from oil, things like that get decided at these conferences as well. And then our district conference, superintendent, and that's mainly the rights and responsibilities of laity. And we see a lot of overlap with the annual conference when it comes to laity as well. And then the local church, we have our charge or church conference and the pastor in charge. And so that's kind of the decision-making, how that all falls, and the importance of general conference there. I don't know that you can read any of this. This is just another map to kind of show how things are interconnected and what the responsibilities of all these different churches are. I really don't think it's too small to be read, but it is available. I can send it if you would like, or you can find it online. And it just kind of gives a rundown of what each of these does. We can go into more in depth if you are interested, but more of what I said. And that's really all that I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions. This slide is actually for 2020. This was the theme was supposed to be. This is like the logo for General Conference, and know that I am God. It was all over the place. So I think they'll probably reuse it for 2022, but just including that there. And that's what I have. If there are any questions or anything you'd like me to go back over, I kind of just ran through it all.
Well, I don't see anybody that put also a question into the chat room, but so again, the issue of the next general conference is in 2022 still scheduled for Minneapolis,
I believe so.
and that will be in August of 2022. Is that what we anticipate?
I
don't remember, to be honest.
Let me Google it really quick because it'll be really easy to find.
Okay.
But I do believe it's still in Minneapolis.
Okay. And Caleb is giving a thumbs up on that. So
August,
that would
the end of August through the beginning of September.
okay. So that's the time frame. So we still got 13 months out before that, and see what happens with particularly international delegates being able to come here was the reason that it had to be again postponed this year. So one could presume that this whole issue will come up again. I mean, in the interim, there have been some other plans, and we'll be talking more about those. But General Conference can, in fact, dictate and direct what's going to be happening for the denomination. Is that correct?
Yes. So General Conference, right now, what we're looking at is a change in our discipline. Our discipline currently has a stance of homosexuality that does not allow people who are clergy members and to be in relationships, and does not promote it within the church as well. That's currently in our discipline. So moving forward, looking at 2022, General Conference is the only governing body that we have that can address that. And so what we had in 2019 was we took that out of General Conference because every year for a long time, that has taken up a huge portion of General Conference, and we haven't gotten a lot of other business done because it's on so many people's hearts. And so 2019 was an attempt to somehow come to a conclusion that everyone was happy with and move forward as a church. And that after the General Conference 2019 happened, turns out we did not find a solution that we were satisfied with and continued in fighting. So General Conference 2022, we will also be addressing this issue. Is where we're at.
For the other clergy that are on the line, do they anticipate that actually, I'm going to shift over here. We just someone notes that while General Conference adjusts the book of discipline, what can local churches do to move forward is certainly a question that I think everybody is trying to sort out. And as we discuss this in the next couple of sessions and within our own church, and that our churches here in this area, that's certainly going to be, I think, the big question. Did Caleb, did you or Caitlin have any thoughts on that?
Pastor Caleb asked the question, so
I know he did. I just wanted to see if it was a rhetorical question or what. So,
so the difficulty is General Conference decides on discipline level, right? We as local churches, what can we do to move forward? We're kind of in a standstill. We're preparing for what's going to happen, but we don't really know what the result is going to be. And so through the last General Conference, we saw these structures beginning to put in place if churches want to leave the denomination. So depending on who you talk to, there are churches that are leaving the denomination. And it's a very complicated process because the conference owns the buildings. Like the United Methodist Church owns our buildings, not the local church, which makes it a very complicated process, as well as the clergy members are not part of that local church. They're a part of the annual conference. So it's a very complicated process. Most churches are just waiting to see what happens. There are some that are planning to form a new denomination or have left or are planning to leave. We saw, especially in reaction in 2019, a lot of churches were taking United Methodist off their signs, or really drastic reactions right away. And so trying to deal with what to do in their way to move forward. But there isn't a concrete great answer to that, just because we don't really know. And should local churches or annual conferences or jurisdictions vote on this matter? You could vote on this matter. It's not going to change the discipline. A lot of times we hesitate to do that because we don't know what the discipline is going to say. So we don't want to put the cart in front of the horse. We're waiting to see what happens before we move too far forward because we just don't know. So there's a difference between preparing and then like forcing something that might not happen. That can create a lot of tension, create a lot of unrest when, again, we just don't know what the future is going to be. And so some annual conferences, like even this year, I have a friend who's out east, and there were people pushing at their annual conference to make a vote about whether or not the annual conference would leave the general conference. I mean, they were pushing for it. They ended up, Bishop guided them away from that. And so they ended up not making that vote. But there are conferences and churches who are pushing for that. It just depends.
Mhm. Has anyone actually voted that you're aware of? I mean, at a conference level?
Not that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. Not that I'm aware of. I feel like it would make big news if it did happen, but not that I'm aware of. There are local churches that have.
Darren, you'd asked the question, can you provide some historical clarity as to why America isn't its own central conference or conferences? What have been the pros and cons of that historical decision?
Yeah, of course. So it wasn't really some sort of historical decision. The United Methodist Church started in America. And so we started with jurisdictional conference, not even with jurisdictional conferences. What happened is we started in America. It started where all of the church would meet every year, and then all of the clergy would meet. Then certain clergy delegates would meet, and then certain lay and clergy delegates would meet as the church grew and grew and grew and grew and needed to be divided up more. So the reason we aren't a central conference is because we have been in the majority for so long as those who started the denomination. And I mean, large majority. The central conferences started as missionary sites that then grew in popularity. And so the central conferences, they are allowed to interpret the general book of discipline that we follow because of cultural reasons. And so we don't want appropriation. We don't want to sort of whitewash their own culture. So they're allowed to adapt that depending on the culture of their area. It's to stop colonization, basically. So we aren't a central conference because it was just never considered or worried about, right? Like we have all these jurisdictions. They were just as large as these central conferences were. And so what we see now is the tension between central conferences can adapt cultural things to make sure that they're not being colonized. We cannot. So whatever is decided in general conference, we follow. We aren't allowed to culturally adapt that to whatever we find fits our culture best. And so central conferences are growing and growing and growing. Churches in the United States are diminishing. And so we're beginning to see this sort of difference between those within the United States with outside of the United States and that tension there. And there is a lot of frustration that the general conferences don't have to follow the book of discipline and we do. But I just want to say, like, I do understand that frustration. I do understand that tension, but it really was a good thing that they're allowed to culturally adapt it. We've seen through history for a long time of what happens when religions go in, completely take over a culture. Look at what happened to the Native Americans in the United States, and that culture is just killed off. And so we did do something here to protect those cultures, and it is a good thing. There are just some ramifications that weren't anticipated. One of the proposals for 2020 was making the United States a central conference so that we too could adapt. But well, I'm not sure exactly how those have transferred to 2022.
Darren, did that answer your question?
It did.
Thank you. Thank you. Lori had asked the question, is there a risk of the issue not being voted on at the general conference and therefore no progress on the issue and it gets just pushed down the road?
Yes, and that is what we saw for a very long time. And that is why General Conference of 2019 happened, because we could just never get there. And could never get there based on having other things at General Conference we had to cover, mainly couldn't get there based on how just difficult this topic was and what it led to in a lot of people. So a lot of times the conference would actually be halted for holy conferencing and prayer just because it would get too heated to continue on. And so that would happen and then it would just get tabled. And so that's been kind of what was happening over and over and over. There's also, it might be like these topics might be voted on and might not receive enough of the issue, or who can table the issue. I believe that that is the Council of Bishops, as they run the General Conference. I don't know if it needs a vote. It might need a vote to also be tabled. I'm not entirely sure on that. But what was I saying? I don't remember where I was going. I turned to that, sorry. But yeah, so it can also be voted on, but if it needs a 2/3 vote and doesn't reach the 2/3 vote, it can have a majority without reaching the 2/3 and not be enacted. That's a possibility too, even if it is voted.
Lori asked as a follow-up question, who can table the issue?
Yeah, I think the Council of Bishops. I'm not sure if it needs a vote or not to be tabled, but I think that's who does. There's a lot more I'm gonna.
Doesn't sound like it's likely to get tabled this next time, but we'll see.
You know, we've been saying that for decades, so it's hard to tell. It really is hard to tell.
Are there other questions? Is this noted there?
Yeah,
there
Pastor Caleb said there are other pastors in the meeting. Yeah. Are there any other insights that pastors would like to add?
Well, I mean, I know there was a lot of unofficial development before the pandemic hit, with a group meeting that was representative of the spectrum, right? And so it made big news that a compromise has been struck, but it was nothing official. So I wonder if anybody had heard that or thought about that. A lot of people were talking about that, but the reality was that was not an official action on any part, although it did make a number of us think there might be something new this General Conference versus these decades of kicking the can down the road.
You know, something I would simply add is, well, how about if we address Bruce's question? I do want to say something about how there's things that are happening that we're hearing in the news, and then obviously a lot of things happening that we're not hearing in the news. And just, again, just a word about how to interpret some of that. But should we go to Bruce's question first, Dave?
Sure, which is essentially at the General Conference, will there be some kind of a draft, as Josh was just referencing, of something new, or will they be debating and or discussing an existing proposal? And I don't know if we know what the answer to that is. Who sets the agenda?
So I missed what Pastor Josh said. I had audio issues, so I'm sorry. I totally missed what you said. So I'm not sure. Were you talking about draft? Like you can draft at conference? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I was just making reference to the unofficial gathering and discussion about what's become known as the protocol, which is there were a number of people from across the spectrum that discussed a potential piece of legislation to bring to the next General Conference. And most of us were anticipating that would be brought and would potentially create overcome the blockade or the impasse that we've found ourselves in for decades. And then of course the pandemic. And so I personally don't really know much about where that is, or even if, but the important thing to remember is that was not an official anything in terms of the United Methodist Church. It was just representative people that were discussing possible solutions, but it made the news, so most of us probably heard about it.
Yeah, so for General Conference, there are prepared proposals that make the agenda. You submit it X amount of days, and that, or not, I think months beforehand, and then it can be distributed, so everyone can read it. When we come, we can be educated, make this happen, and not take as long. There are things that can be lifted up on the floor during conference as well, so it makes it hard to predict and hard to know, but there usually is quite a bit going into it. So we saw that in 2019. There were multiple plans, but that were well documented ahead of time so that they would go in and vote on.
Caleb, do you want to comment on your last thing in terms about the differences between the United Methodist Church and other non-Methodist bodies as to how we deal with this kind of a conflict?
Yes, I just wanted to, again, I think if you've been in the denomination a long time, or, you have a sense of how things work in terms of the larger structure, I think when we first had these conversations around human sexuality and everyone was, wondering what happened in 2019, and we started having these conversations, what was illuminating in our conversations was the fact that a lot of United Methodists, we don't understand our own structure and how decisions are made, and how, when it comes to issues like this, how changes are made. And so again, just to acknowledge, there's pros and cons of our larger structure. This could go either as a pro or a con. We are a connectional body, and as much as we'd like to simply take a church vote and make our own decision on everything, we can't. And we recognize that we're part of this larger structure, and there's really only one body that speaks to the larger denomination. And if we're going to be part of this denomination, we have this kind of very complicated and intricate process that we have to follow, including if we want legislation to be voted on at General Conference, it has to be drafted and has to be submitted months in advance. So there's this large process that just, I think, having an awareness of as United Methodists. Again, I think folks who aren't aware of United Methodist polity and structure, when you ask the question, how do I make a change, one way or the other, you have to know kind of the rules of the game, and you have to know how the structure works, and how, if you want to make a change, you have to follow kind of these procedures working within these bodies. So that's where I just wanted to, again, emphasize, this is why we're discussing this, because we are different from, say, just a Baptist church down the street who just, gets their congregation together, they get a vote and they make a decision. Our process is much longer, good or bad. It takes, more time and more people. And so it can feel like we're trying to move a battleship at times, because it's a very slow process, especially when you think that General Conference, again, which is the only body that can speak for the whole denomination, meets only every 4 years. So you have a group of decisions that have been passed, and then we're stuck with it, and we're living with it for 4 years. And the only exception is when something like a General Conference is called, a special General Conference is called, as was the case in 2019. I do want to ask, we do have Pastor Terry Novi with us, Pastor Isla Sampson. If you want to add any insights just from your experience with a conference as well. And again, Pastor Josh, Pastor Caitlyn, and I, we all have different insights. But let me ask, especially the pastors, any other insights you would share about working within the structure, and how understanding our structure as the United Methodist denomination, how that helps or hinders this process. Let me, Pastor Novi, can you say anything here? Or are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. I am here, Caleb. I actually have, I'm going to be quite frank. I have confusions with the way things work in the system as well. Having come up as laity and only dealing with things on that that level. I've only been lead pastor for like 2 years, and as local licensed pastor, we don't have the in-depth studies as you did in seminary on exactly how the whole system works. So just when I think I've got it figured out, I find out I have no clue, quite honestly. It's, so I'm here to learn as well. So thank you for that.
Pastor Josh?
Pastor Caleb, kind of expanding on what you were talking about in terms of how we compared to maybe other mainline Christian denominations, we are much more, we kind of have to act together. We're not locally governed or autonomous as much as maybe some of our friends over in the Presbyterian Church or over in the Episcopal Church. And then to even make that more intense, the United Methodist Church had great missionary success and grew across the globe. And what that means is that when we have to make decisions together, we actually have to make decisions across cultures that have been having vastly different conversations. So we may feel like we've been having a certain conversation here in the United States, here in our particular region. Why aren't we all going in the same direction? Well, we're connected with people throughout the world that have been having different other conversations, and maybe not particularly this conversation in this way. So that oftentimes I talk with folks where that is, we don't understand how we're not able to make the same moves if that's where we are, depending as our friends down the street or our friends over here. And it's because it's not because we're not ideologically diverse. It's because we're actually very connected, and we make these decisions together.
Pastor Idla, do you want to say anything?
Well, thank you, first of all, for allowing me to join with you. I am from Prairie Central, but when I found this online, I thought, wow, this would be an interesting place to come and just converse with my clergy brothers and sisters. In my opinion, I think what the church is feeling right now is an anxiety. And I'm trying to look for a direction that is more healthy for my congregation, as well as a small community that I'm nurturing to be a new charter congregation. But I think Bishop John Hopkins today kind of touched on something that kind of helped me understand that many of our churches are actually now starting to divide on theological basis. And we need to understand that that is happening. And many of our churches are not necessarily red or blue, but they're purple. And my biggest concern is, including my church itself, is how are we going to tackle this in a healthy manner going forward? And I'm seeking to look for answers. That's why I joined your group, so I can struggle with you to provide a healthy step forward for us in unity and appreciating our theological diversity as well. I think in the conversation we've been having, we need to admit that there is a theological diversity among us, not just on local level, but I think on both jurisdictional level and in the College of Bishops as well. So we have to acknowledge that. And we don't know what's coming, but I think we need a lot of spiritual guidance, but the Spirit's move for us to stay healthy in the process. And that's what I'm looking for, not to be controversial and not to look for division and conflict. So how can we do that? That would be my question.
You know, when I think of what is it that we can do as United Methodists, especially in congregations that are purple. I think there's, some congregations that are very clearly, again, let's just acknowledge every congregation has theological differences. Every family has theological differences. My wife and I differ theologically, but we're able to exist under the same roof, and not want to, kill each other, especially. But I think when it comes to certain topics, it just brings out the worst in us. And we're seeing that not only in families, but in our local churches, my goodness. So again, in those congregations that are just clearly one side or another, maybe this isn't as much of an issue, but in a lot of churches, and I'm at Faith, United Methodist Church in Orland Park, our church is very purple. And so the question then is, how do we, one, acknowledge the fact that we do have theological differences, two, just offer the assurance, it's okay. We don't all have the right answers, and we don't have to all agree on everything, every matter under the sun. But then three, how do we talk through differences in a healthy and respectful way, an informed way, in a loving way, right? So I feel like that's the challenge in so many of our churches now, is how do we wrestle with the issues that we need to wrestle with maturely, but how do we do it in a way that honors and respects one another? And being informed about all of this.
When I teach United Methodist 101 classes, I always say, I think one of the most interesting things about the United Methodist Church is that we are such a large umbrella, that we have both the Clintons and the Bushes. How many people can say they have all of that under their umbrella, right? Mm-hmm. So it's an opportunity for us of how we have those holy conversations. Are we able to discuss these huge differences that we have on all these different ways of life and be that example into the world? Or are we going to infight and kind of like we are right now or have been? It's an opportunity to show the world how we can get together. Darren did ask a question. Yeah. He's asked, some individuals have asked why the result of the 2019 General Conference on this position didn't become the last word. So any decisions made at General Conference can be unmade at the next General Conference. So that is why it is not the final decision. It is always back up for debate because you can change those decisions. So that would be why. Again, I think it is helpful to think about the structure of the United Methodist Church kind of like the American government, since they were created at the same time. There are a lot of those back and forths that we see between the two. They both have long processes. They both start at a local level and then kind of grow from there. And then and things can be done and undone as well, policy-wise.
I really like that last question too, because if you notice, every time there's an administration change, again, in the world of politics, in the first 100 days of President Trump, or the first 100 days of President Biden, what happened, right? Mm-hmm. Things that were established as the rule of law, executive order under one administration, it changed. It doesn't mean that it's permanent. And I think, again, recognizing that as United Methodists, we're all moving on, a phrase to keep in mind is we're all moving on to perfection. We're all growing in our faith. And, which is to say, there is no particular group that has all the right answers and has a special, clearance into the special book in heaven that has everything correct, and we're all working on it. And so just to recognize whatever it is that we decide at any general conference or any other conference, we're all just doing the best we can, and we do our work with humility and understanding that things can change in the future.
Caitlyn, you have one more question there. It's an interesting one about the judicial branch of our church, if you will.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally know what your question is, Bruce. I'm not sure that I understand it. So General Conference can change our constitution, our book of discipline. And then from there, that's to be upheld by like annual conferences, bishops. Those are the folks who uphold that. Things can be deemed unconstitutional in that they aren't upholding the discipline. But they can be changed every general conference. So what is in our general conference on the floor, if someone is trying to do something that that conflicts with something already passed, that would be brought up on the floor during general conference. So if you're trying to pass a petition, but we already have words that are the exact opposite within the discipline, that gets addressed there. But I'm not sure that answers what your question is.
One of the things that I thought there was a committee that could look at the conformance of anything that was passed and either say no, that does not conform with the Book of Discipline, or it is a logical extension thereof. And
Yes, there is. I'm not sure what that committee is called, but I do know they have X amount of days to do it after general conference.
Right.
And then on the annual conference level, our bishop does that and has X amount of days to do that during annual conference.
So I'm pretty sure. So after 2019, 2019's general conference met. Again, they made their decision, and really the next step that happened right away is the Judicial Council did meet here in Chicago, in fact, and they had a certain number of days, and they had to declare constitutionality or hear the challenges to the constitutionality or whatever else of some of the legislation that was passed. And so again, this is a body that's it does again act like the judicial system that would declare something constitutional or not.
And so they look back through like the book of discipline and things. They aren't going based off of their opinion. They look back through, does this work with what we have in the discipline, or is it contrary to it?
Right.
Well, I don't see any other questions. I do see obviously the importance of our next presentation on August 28th about the history of the homosexuality conflict.
Lori raised her hand. I don't know if she has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Dave. It's kind of a weird question, and I don't even know if it's going to fall under this, and so I didn't want to type it. And I guess I'm kind of going into my everyday life asking this, but we were talking about constitutionality. So, I mean, how does these rules affect then like the outside laws and rules? You know, we have laws against discrimination. We have laws against certain things. You know, how? I guess I never stop to think. How in a weird way do we get away with it? To put it bluntly, you know, I guess that's where I'm kind of struggling with now, because if we decide, okay, something is in our Constitution, but it goes against a law in the general world, how can, you know, how do those two mesh?
You're looking at mainly like discrimination.
Correct.
Particularly on this topic in regards to discrimination.
Correct.
And so that is where the United States law is a little more gray, because we have freedom of religion. And so that falls into freedom of religion for this particular topic. That's also why it's so difficult to be a global church, because there are different governments that are overseeing other. So like if you think about it in a country where it's illegal to be gay, it's going to be a very different approach than in the United States. So that's how complex this issue is, as I think as Pastor Josh was saying, on the global scale, when we look at this as, I mean, this is a global decision we're making.
I think I need to be a little bit more honest here. In 2019 General Conference, a vote was taken, and you know, decisions were made, but not necessarily they were followed. So we need to just be very honest with each other and know that many of the decisions made aren't necessarily followed in this particular subject matter. I mean, our own conference is a clear example of that. So I think moving forward, whatever the General Conference decides on 2022 would have to be very decisive, so that laws are not broken. Because if laws are not obeyed, then what's the use of them? So there is more than just a discrimination issue. For coming from a background from outside this country, I know this issue is not just an issue of discrimination, it's an issue of morality for the many other parts of the world. So for us, it may seem like a very easy answer, but it's not for the rest of the world. So we should not just, superimpose our opinion, but then the unity of the church is also an important factor. So if we want to become another central conference, where does our, ecclesial unity lies, and what does that mean as a body of Jesus Christ? Are we then continue to be divided and subdivided? So this issue is very complex. but yeah, it is equally difficult for our situation because our churches would have to deal with it sooner or later. And choices may have to come down to that, unfortunately, which is going to affect our membership as well as our giving. And that is the true reality that the bishop mentioned today. And I was very glad that he was honest about it.
Mhm.
And I think again, as Pastor Isla mentioned, it's important to remember in 2019, again, when the traditional plan was passed, it was passed with a lot of teeth, actually. So it was very clear, if you do X, then here's exactly what's going to happen, instead of, there being a lot of wiggle room for interpretation or other things. So just this is an issue not only I would say of morality but legality here, because there's so much. Again, the question is, are we going to follow any of the laws that we agree on? There's a lot of gray that we're wrestling with now as a denomination. It's really messy on a whole bunch of levels. So it'll be very important for us to, again, address this together. And if nothing else, just try to be honest with ourselves. Whether we agree or disagree, when we agree on some kind of laws and consequences and we vote on it properly, shouldn't that be the law of the land, and the consequences then be the law of the land? So anyway, that's part of the landscape we're in right now, and that's what makes this very, very difficult.
And a final comment here from Darren about it might be interesting to examine the biggest 10 changes made to the Book of Discipline over the last whatever number of years. He said 1968 to the present, to provide example as to the magnitude of decisions made since the founding of the church. I don't know, has anybody ever put that together?
Might be out there. I don't know, but it might be.
Yeah.
Well, where I was trying to go with that is, it's a Book of Discipline's a living document, and we've discussed that today. And I think the other issue is, with a topic, when you have a vote and it's 90-10, it's kind of easy for people to say the will of the majority was understood. When we as Americans, or we as UMC, make decisions 52 to 48%, or 45-55, when things are close and are up for discussion, that matter's not just going to close and we all move on. And so what I was really trying to say, though, is that the Book of Discipline's a living document, and we're not just operating under the version 1 we had at our founding.
I do want to say most of the things that get discussed and passed at General Conference and Annual Conference are incredibly boring. This is not like very typical of what we talk about at these conferences. So I'm not sure that there are going to be any like huge changes, more like little changes, but I'm sure there's still a handful of bigger ones.
Well, we're rapidly approaching the end of our hour here, and we promised to keep this to an hour. So unless there are other comments, I would just want to, number one, thank Caitlyn for her presentation, and that the insight that we've received, not only from Reverend Nesbit, but from the other members of the clergy who've been with us today. So again, I want to thank everyone, and it's important that, as Reverend Elias said, that we need to make sure that we're listening to the full spectrum of people and understand the from whence they come and how they come to their perspectives on this very challenging issue. So I think again, Reverend Hong's presentation in August, sort of on the history of this particular conflict, will be helpful. And then as we move into September, hearing from our district superintendent about our own conference and how strategically and operationally we will fit into the decision making is going to be very important, so that we and others can communicate that to the rest of the laity and the affiliates of our church. So again, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate it, particularly Caitlyn, for doing this right after a new assignment. Not an easy thing to do, so we appreciate it. Any other comments? If not, I think we'll go ahead and adjourn. Thanks, everybody.